here to our set. With me now, Bruce Klingner, a 20-year U.S. intelligence veteran, including time as the CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea, now a Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And then our panel for the hour, Josh Lederman, National Security and Foreign Policy Reporter for the Associated Press, and White House reporter for the Washington Examiner, Sarah Westwood. Thank you all for being here. Kind of the dream team to talk about all of this happening today. And Bruce, I'll start with you. You heard Kelly talking about who the intended recipient of this message is. What you have said, we shouldn't be surprised by the surprise, essentially, that you're surprised by the surprise about what's happening now between North Korea and the U.S. Explain that.
Well, the people are being surprised by North Korea's continuing increasing capabilities on nuclear and missile capabilities. We've known about that it's in work for some time, so we may not know exactly where they are on the development path, but we know what path they're on, and we know what their objectives are. When I was at CIA in the late 90s, we did an unclassified national intelligence estimate that predicted North Korea would have a nuclear ICBM to be able to target all of the continental U.S. by 2015. So we were off a few years, but it shouldn't be a surprise.
But this is interesting to me because this is not yet a fact, right? This is an intelligence assessment from one intelligence agency. Do you think there's wiggle room here, or based on your assessment, do you think this is really happening on the ground in North Korea?
North Korea is the hardest of the hard targets. Yeah. So analysts do their best with limited information, and so different analysts or different agencies may disagree. We don't know the details of this report, but the media report identifies that it was the intelligence community. So whether this is a national intelligence estimate or just the view of one agency, we don't know. But whether North Korea has this capability today, tomorrow, or next year, in a way is irrelevant. We know what objective they have.
And the objective, of course,
is to be able to threaten the United States and its allies with nuclear weapons.
We've seen President Trump obviously firing back. I think that's the way to phrase it. You heard Kelly talk about that tweet, specifically one referencing renovating or modernizing the nuclear arsenal. Josh, give us a fact check here, because that doesn't seem to be possible.
Right. Well, we've been looking into this morning, and President Trump is right that he issued an executive order in his first days in office that said we're going to have a review to ensure that our nuclear deterrent is up to speed, it's modern, it's rigorous, and it's prepared to deal with 21st century threats. They haven't released yet from the White House any result of that review, but we do know that there's a modernization of the nuclear triad, as they say, that was started under President Obama, that is continuing. It's in the early stages, and so far we don't know that there's been a whole lot of progress.
As Malcolm Nance points out in that tweet we just saw, it takes years. This is not something he would do in 7 months.
Right, exactly, and that's kind of one of the criticisms of this tweet. We don't know exactly what he was referring to, likely the executive order. But President Trump has been clear from the days of the campaign that one of the top criticisms he had of President Obama was that Obama telegraphed in advance everything basically that he planned to do in response to international conflicts, and that it was well known among world leaders that Obama was reluctant or unwilling to use military force. So President Trump has always tried to make everyone in the world believe that he would use military force at the slightest provocation. And there was no forewarning of the missile strike in Syria in April. There was no forewarning that the Pentagon was going to use a Moab in the Middle East. President Trump has always tried to create this perception that he's ready and willing to use military force, because that's sort of at the crux of his America First strength-based foreign policy.
And Bruce, I want to talk with you about whether that is the right policy or whether that is the right position for the president to take. And there's something interesting. The president spoke with Tim Russert, obviously from NBC, back in 1999, specifically about North Korea. And I wonder if it gives a little bit of a window of insight into somebody who, as Sarah rightfully points out, has always said, I'm not going to foreshadow what I'm going to do. So listen to what the president had to say to Tim back then, and then I want to talk to you about it.
The former Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, said you could not launch a preemptive strike against North Korea because the nuclear fallout could be devastating to the Asian Peninsula. But if the military told you, Mr. Trump, we can't do this.
You give me two names. You're giving me two names. I don't know. You want to do it in 5 years when they have warheads all over the place, every one of them pointing to New York City, to Washington, and every one of our... Is that when you want to do it, or do you want to do something now? You better do it now. And if they think you're serious, I deal with lots of people. If they think you're serious, they'll negotiate, and it'll never come to that.
Is this a window into the president's perspective now?
Well, it's those comments, as well as the comments yesterday about fire and fury, they may be intended to signal resolve to defend ourselves and our allies, but they're affirming concerns by our allies that the U.S. may be preparing a preventative attack. As H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, said recently that the president has asked the military to prepare for such an option. Any kind of military attack against North Korea could, as Secretary of Defense Mattis said, have catastrophic consequences. When I was doing war games in the government, the alliance always won, but it was at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties, and that was before we thought they had nuclear weapons.
Rex Tillerson is obviously very aware of that, Josh. You just spent some time traveling with him. I think you got back yesterday?
That's right, last night.
Do you think he understands, obviously, the gravity of the situation, but also how to handle this now?
I think that he is very focused and committed to the strategy that he's pursuing. Even today in Guam, as we're seeing these new escalating threats from Trump and from North Korea, Tillerson is saying there's no need to change our strategy. Our strategy is working, and look at these UN sanctions as a result, and that North Korea is acting out this way because they feel increased pressure.
We are going to talk more about Guam, why Guam, coming up later in the show, but we also want to talk about, frankly, Cuba, because Seb Gorka was out this morning, an advisor to the president, talking about it. A comparison that some have made. And I want you to listen to this. And Sarah, I want to get your reaction after this because it was, I think, startling to some folks. Listen.
These are the moments when we have to come together as a nation and support the executive. Whether you voted for him or not, whether they're a Democrat, whether they're a Republican, these are the trying times. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we stood behind JFK. This is analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Is that the analogy that we should be making here? What's happening now is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, of course, was a very different sort of time, very different situation, very different leaders in that role.
Some folks have been making that comparison. Darrell Issa, Republican congressman from California, has been a prominent person who immediately came out and said that this is the most serious nuclear threat to face the American homeland since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what Sebastian Gorka is kind of referring to is this effect known as rally around the flag effect, where, you know, presidents sometimes do see bumps in approval when we face international conflicts. President Trump faced a spike in his approval ratings after the missile strike in Syria. I don't know that that's maybe the appropriate takeaway to approach this conflict with, but it is a phenomenon that pollsters often see, maybe what Gorka was referring to.
Bruce, before I let you go, I want to get your take on who this message was aimed at, because there is some, was it aimed at China? We talk about sort of who the audience is here. Clearly it was Kim Jong-un. Was it also China?
I think messages have multiple recipients.
Yeah.
So clearly the president and the rest of the administration is trying to signal North Korea to back away from their programs and to show U.S. resolve. Also to China that if the U.S. is willing to do a military attack, then China should step up its game to increase pressure on North Korea to prevent that kind of attack. And then the messaging to the allies is resolve, but perhaps the language itself was over the top.
Bruce Klingner, thank you very much for joining us and for your perspective. I appreciate it. I'm going to ask Josh and Sarah to stick around. And as we talked about later in the show, we will get into more about Guam and what happens there. But we're also looking at what's going on here at home. The answer? Not much, with the president blaming his stalled agenda on the Senate and the Senate's top Republican firing back.